People only laugh at something until everyone else wants one. The third delivery truck pulled into Brookstone Meadows just after sunrise. Its flatbed carried cedar planters, river stones, reclaimed fence boards, and bundles of native wildflowers. Two workers climbed down, unfolded a clipboard, and walked toward the Peterson family's front yard across the street. I watched from my porch with a warm mug of coffee resting between my hands while the scent of damp mulch drifted through the cool spring air. I wanted exactly like Nathan's, Mrs. Peterson told the crew, pointing toward my house without noticing I was standing there. One of the workers nodded. We've built 6 of these this month. Across the street, another neighbor stepped outside carrying a garden hose. He smiled at the delivery crew before glancing toward my yard. Looks like another one joined the club. I smiled politely, but said nothing. The morning birds sang from the maple trees lining our street, while the soft breeze carried the smell of fresh cedar across the neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed to life. It sounded like every ordinary Saturday morning in suburban America. Except nothing about Brookstone Meadows felt ordinary anymore. 6 weeks earlier, my yard had been the neighborhood joke. Now people were copying every detail. The raised cedar flower beds, the reclaimed wooden borders, the natural stone path winding through patches of colorful native flowers. Even the handmade lanterns I had built from old fence posts. None of it had been expensive. None of it had come from some luxury landscape company. Most of it came from weekends, Sir Muscles, reclaimed lumber, and ideas sketched on the back of grocery receipts. Yet somehow, the very yard that had once been mocked during an HOA meeting had become the most requested design in the neighborhood. A white SUV slowed as it passed my driveway. I didn't need to see the license plate. I recognized the vehicle immediately. Brenda Holloway. She drove slower than usual. Much slower. Her blue eyes moved from the Petersons' new cedar planters to the Johnson family's matching stone border, then to the Andersons' freshly planted wildflowers. Every house she looked at carried another piece of my original design. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. She never looked toward me. She didn't have to. The entire street already answered the question she wasn't ready to ask. How had the yard she once called an embarrassment to the neighborhood become the style everyone suddenly wanted? The SUV rolled quietly toward her own perfectly symmetrical property. Perfect green lawn. Perfect imported shrubs. Perfect identical flower beds copied from every landscaping catalog in America. For the first time since I moved into Brookstone Meadows, Brenda's yard looked strangely ordinary. Mine didn't. I took another sip of coffee as sunlight spilled across the cedar planter nearest my porch. The wood had already weathered into a soft silver tone, exactly as I'd hoped it would. Bees drifted lazily between purple coneflowers, while butterflies landed on patches of black-eyed Susans that hadn't even existed when I bought the house. The neighborhood had changed. Not because someone ordered it to. Because people saw something they genuinely liked. Brenda spent years trying to make every yard look the same. I had accidentally reminded everyone why they bought houses instead of apartments. As another truck backed into the Petersons' driveway, I could almost hear the laughter from 6 weeks earlier echoing inside the clubhouse. The laughter that started this entire story. The laughter Brenda herself had encouraged when she held up a photograph of my front yard and told 30 homeowners it looked more like a roadside yard sale than a respectable home. She thought everyone would remember the joke. Instead, they remembered the garden. My name is Nathan Brooks, and 6 weeks before my front yard quietly spread across an entire neighborhood, it was nothing more than a pile of weathered cedar boards, river rocks, and ideas most people would have driven straight to the landfill. The first thing I noticed after buying the house wasn't the peeling paint or the cracked walkway. It was the silence. Not peaceful silence. Predictable silence. Every front yard on my street looked almost identical. The same neatly trimmed hedges. The same imported shrubs planted in perfectly symmetrical rows. The same bright red mulch spread beneath the same ornamental trees. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like someone had copied the same photograph 30 times. I had spent 12 years designing outdoor spaces for clients across Ohio. Not expensive landscapes. Personal ones. Places where people actually wanted to sit with a cup of coffee, watch butterflies drift between native flowers, or listen to birds instead of traffic. I believed a yard should tell a story, not follow a template. After my divorce, I wasn't looking for another big project. I wanted a smaller house. A quieter life. Somewhere I could work with my hands again. Brookstone Meadows looked perfect, at least from the listing photos. The morning after moving in, I loaded my old pickup with reclaimed cedar fencing I had salvaged from a historic farmhouse demolition. The wood carried decades of character, silver gray grain, tiny nail holes, and just enough imperfections to remind you it had lived another life before finding mine. The smell of aged cedar filled the truck as I backed into the driveway. Fresh coffee rested on the tailgate beside a sketchbook already filled with rough drawings. Raised flower beds, curved stone borders, native wildflowers instead of imported ornamentals, solar lanterns built from old fence posts. Nothing extravagant, just honest materials arranged with care. I spent the next several weekends digging, measuring, and building beneath warm spring skies. Every shovel of soil released the rich scent of damp earth. Every hammer strike echoed softly through the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors slowed during evening walks to watch the project take shape. Some smiled politely. Others looked confused. One older gentleman stopped while walking his Labrador. "That's reclaimed cedar?" "It is. Haven't seen anyone use that in years. It deserved another chance." He nodded slowly before continuing down the sidewalk. Those conversations became part of my routine. People weren't criticizing. They were curious. The garden slowly found its own rhythm. Purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, little, blue-stem grass swaying with the breeze, smooth river stones outlining winding paths instead of perfectly straight borders. Everything attracted bees, butterflies, and songbirds. The yard wasn't loud. It was alive. Then, one Tuesday morning, just as I finished placing the last cedar planter beneath my front window, I heard the unmistakable sound of expensive heels clicking across the concrete sidewalk. Sharp, steady, confident. I looked up. A white SUV sat parked beside the curb. A woman wearing a pastel blazer, pearl earrings, and designer sunglasses walked toward my driveway with a black clipboard tucked beneath one arm. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't compliment the flowers. She simply scanned my yard from left to right with the practiced expression of someone searching for flaws instead of beauty. Then she smiled, not because she admired what she saw, because she had already decided it didn't belong. "Interesting," she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "I've never seen someone spend this much effort making a front yard look unfinished." I looked from her to the cedar planter beneath my window. "I actually just finished it." "I'm sure you believe that." She smiled politely, but there wasn't a trace of kindness behind it. "My name is Brenda Holloway. I'm the president of the Brookstone Meadows Homeowners Association." She handed me a business card as though she were introducing herself at a corporate conference instead of standing in my flower bed. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." There was a pause. "And make you aware that our community has certain aesthetic expectations." Her eyes traveled across every inch of my yard. The reclaimed cedar, the winding stone path, the clusters of native flowers, the handmade lantern hanging from an old fence post. She didn't see craftsmanship. She saw something different, something that refused to match everything around it. "I reviewed the architectural guidelines before I moved in," I said. "I don't remember seeing any rule against native gardens." "There isn't." She adjusted her sunglasses. "But homeowners are encouraged to maintain property values." "I intend to." Another pause. "You might be surprised how buyers respond to originality." She laughed softly. "Oh, Nathan." It was the first time she'd used my name. It sounded less like friendliness and more like someone correcting a child. This neighborhood wasn't built to be original. Then she turned and walked back toward her white SUV, her heels clicking rhythmically against the sidewalk until the sound disappeared around the corner. I watched her leave before kneeling beside one of the flower beds again. A honeybee landed on a purple coneflower only inches from my hand. It didn't care what the HOA thought. Neither did the butterfly drifting lazily toward the milkweed. For the next few days, life continued normally. I planted more wildflowers, installed another cedar border, built 2 matching planter boxes beside the porch. Neighbors occasionally slowed to look. A few waved. One young couple pushing a stroller stopped for several minutes. "I love those lanterns," the wife said. "Did you make them?" "I did. Would you ever build one for us?" "Sure." Her husband smiled. "They're different." I thanked them before returning to work. Small conversations like that happened almost every afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just curiosity. Then came Thursday evening, the monthly HOA meeting. I didn't attend. I still had half a truckload of reclaimed wood waiting to become another raised garden bed. The smell of fresh-cut cedar filled my garage while an old country station played quietly from a dusty radio balanced on my workbench. Around 7:30, my phone buzzed. A text from my next-door neighbor, Bill. You should have been at the meeting. A second message arrived before I could answer. Brenda showed everyone pictures of your yard. I frowned. Another vibration. She actually put them on the projector. My hand stopped moving. The hammer rested quietly on the workbench. Then came one final message. People laughed. I stared at those two words for a long moment. Not because strangers had laughed. I've worked construction long enough to know opinions are free. What stayed with me wasn't the laughter. It was the decision behind it. Someone had taken photographs of my home, printed them, projected them onto a giant screen, and turned another homeowner's front yard into entertainment. The next morning, as I walked outside carrying my coffee, I found an official HOA newsletter folded neatly beneath my front doormat. Across the top, in bold letters, one headline immediately caught my attention. Maintaining community standards. Beneath it was a full-color photograph of my yard. The newsletter felt heavier than a single sheet of paper should. I carried it inside without unfolding it, set my coffee beside the kitchen sink, and stared at the HOA logo printed across the top. Morning sunlight spilled through the dining room window, casting long shadows over the cedar tabletop, where I finally opened the page. There it was, a full-color photograph of my front yard. The picture had been taken from the sidewalk without my knowledge. Beneath it was a bold caption, an example of landscaping that does not reflect Brookstone Meadows standards. I read the sentence twice, not because I didn't understand it, because I couldn't believe another homeowner had actually approved printing it. There was no official violation, no broken rule, no citation, just an opinion presented as community guidance. The article encouraged residents to maintain consistent visual harmony and avoid experimental landscape concepts that may negatively affect neighborhood appearance. Whoever wrote it never used my name. They didn't have to. Everyone recognized my house. I folded the newsletter neatly and slipped it into the drawer beside the refrigerator. Anger would have been easy. Instead, I walked back outside with my gloves, picked up a shovel, and continued planting. The smell of fresh soil settled into the cool morning air as robins hopped across the lawn searching for worms. Every handful of mulch reminded me why I had started this project in the first place. Not for approval, for peace. By Saturday afternoon, something unexpected happened. The young couple with the stroller returned. This time they weren't just walking. They carried a notebook. "We hope you don't mind," the husband said. "Could you tell us what flowers these are?" I smiled. "Purple coneflowers." He wrote them down. "And these, black-eyed Susans." His wife pointed toward the cedar planter. "Did you buy that?" "I built it." "Would you ever show us how?" "Of course." For nearly an hour we talked about reclaimed lumber, native plants, pollinators, and inexpensive landscaping ideas. They left carrying a page full of notes instead of shopping recommendations. 2 days later, another neighbor stopped. Then another. A retired schoolteacher asked where I found river stones. An older veteran wanted advice on building raised beds because kneeling had become difficult after knee surgery. A father asked if native flowers attracted butterflies for his daughter's science project. None of them mentioned the newsletter. They talked about the yard itself. Curiosity quietly replaced judgment. Meanwhile, Brenda's influence seemed to grow louder. Another HOA email reminded residents to preserve the neighborhood's established character. Another meeting agenda mentioned landscaping consistency. Another reminder encouraged homeowners to seek architectural approval before making significant exterior changes. The neighborhood became strangely divided. Some people hurried past my house without looking. Others slowed down. Every evening, I noticed more walkers stopping for just a few seconds longer than before. One Wednesday, I looked outside to find a silver SUV parked near my mailbox. A woman stepped out holding her phone. She wasn't from the neighborhood. She introduced herself as Claire, a local lifestyle blogger who featured affordable home improvement projects. "I drove 20 minutes after someone shared a picture of your garden online." "My garden," she smiled. "People love it." She slowly walked along the stone path, photographing the cedar planters, the lanterns, and the patches of wildflowers dancing gently in the breeze. "This doesn't look expensive," she said. It wasn't. "It looks achievable." I laughed softly. That was the idea. She lowered her camera. "I think a lot of people are tired of landscapes that all look the same." As she climbed back into her SUV, I noticed Brenda standing across the street beside her mailbox. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching Claire photograph every corner of the yard she had publicly mocked only days before. Claire's article went online the following Friday. I didn't even know she had published it until my phone began vibrating nonstop while I was replacing the last section of an old cedar border beside the driveway. The first text came from Bill next door. "You're internet famous." The second came from the young couple with the stroller. "Your garden is everywhere." I wiped the dirt from my hands before opening the link. The headline made me laugh. "The front yard that proves beautiful landscaping doesn't need a luxury budget." Claire hadn't written about me. She wrote about ideas. About reclaimed cedar instead of imported hardwood. Native flowers instead of expensive ornamental plants. River stones collected from local landscape suppliers rather than polished marble shipped across the country. She listed the cost of every major project. Most people expected several $1,000s. The entire yard had cost less than a single professionally installed flower bed in many upscale neighborhoods. By the end of the weekend, the article had been shared hundreds of times through local community groups. Then something even stranger happened. People started knocking on my front door. Not reporters. Neighbors. Mr. Lawson arrived first. "I've got some old cedar behind my shed," he said. "Think we could turn it into planters?" The retired schoolteacher came the next afternoon carrying graph paper. "I drew my yard," she said with an embarrassed smile. "Would you tell me where you'd plant flowers?" By Tuesday, I had visited 4 different houses. Not because I was starting a business. Because people genuinely wanted help. Nobody asked me to copy magazine covers. They wanted something personal. One family built butterfly gardens for their grandchildren. Another planted vegetables beside flowers. A retired couple replaced thirsty imported shrubs with native grasses that barely needed watering. Every yard became slightly different. That was the point. Meanwhile, Brenda's yard remained exactly the same. Perfectly trimmed hedges. Perfect circles of bright red mulch. Perfect rows of identical evergreen shrubs. It looked like a brochure. Mine looked lived in. One afternoon, while loading leftover cedar boards into my pickup, I noticed Brenda standing with 2 HOA board members near the entrance sign. They weren't talking. They were watching. Not me. The steady stream of neighbors walking through my yard. Children pointed at butterflies resting on purple coneflowers. Adults took photographs of the lanterns hanging from reclaimed fence posts. People asked questions, shared ideas, laughed. The neighborhood that had once hurried past my house was now stopping there almost every evening. A few days later, another surprise arrived. A landscaping supplier delivered 2 pallets of reclaimed cedar to the Johnson family across the street. The following morning, a truck unloaded native plants at the Petersons' driveway. By Friday, 3 more homes displayed freshly built raised planters. None of them looked identical. Each borrowed something different. A curved stone border. A cedar planter. Wildflowers instead of formal hedges. Solar lanterns. Small details. Small inspirations. The transformation spread quietly, almost politely. Nobody announced a movement. Nobody organized anything. People simply saw something they liked and made it their own. Then, on Saturday morning, as I carried coffee onto my porch, I heard the familiar sound of Brenda's white SUV slowing in front of my house. She didn't get out. She rolled past one newly redesigned yard. Then another. Then another. Her expression remained perfectly controlled, but her eyes kept moving from house to house, counting changes she could no longer ignore. For the first time since I'd moved into Brookstone Meadows, the neighborhood no longer reflected one person's definition of perfection. It reflected the people who actually lived there. And I had a feeling Brenda wasn't finished trying to stop it. Brenda made her move on a Thursday evening. The email arrived at exactly 6:02 p.m., just as I was washing cedar sawdust from my hands after finishing another planter for the Lawson family. The subject line was impossible to miss. Special HOA Board Meeting. Proposed Landscape Clarification Amendment. I leaned against the kitchen counter and opened the attachment. The proposal looked harmless at first. New language. Additional definitions. A few highlighted paragraphs. Then I reached the section that mattered. The amendment would prohibit reclaimed construction materials used as visible landscape features, limit front yard flower varieties to an approved planting list, require uniform edging styles, and reserve the HOA's right to reject any design deemed inconsistent with established neighborhood character. I smiled. Not because the proposal was clever. because it arrived too late. I looked out the front window. Across the street, the Peterson family cedar planters were already overflowing with coneflowers. Next door, Bill had finished his raised beds the previous weekend. Farther down the block, 3 more homes now displayed stone paths winding through native gardens. Brenda wasn't trying to stop one yard anymore. She was trying to erase half the neighborhood. Friday evening, homeowners began gathering outside instead of staying indoors. Not for a protest, just conversations. People walked from house to house carrying iced tea, lemonade, folding chairs, and gardening gloves. Someone asked where to buy milkweed. Another neighbor traded leftover river stones for cedar boards. Children chased butterflies between flower beds while adults compared ideas instead of property values. The neighborhood felt different, not rebellious, connected. I spent part of the evening helping Mrs. Lawson install solar lanterns along her garden path. As the last light faded from the sky, warm amber lights flickered on one by one across several front yards. Not identical, related. Each one reflected the family living behind it. Saturday morning brought another surprise. A local newspaper published Claire's story. This time it wasn't buried inside a lifestyle section. It appeared on the front page of the community edition beneath a headline that read, "Neighbors redefine curb appeal through creativity in native gardens." By lunchtime, more visitors arrived. Not tourists. Residents from nearby neighborhoods looking for ideas. Cars parked along both sides of the street. People admired butterfly gardens, asked questions, took photographs, bought coffee from the cafe around the corner before walking through Brookstone Meadows. Small businesses benefited. Neighbors met neighbors. The street felt alive. Around 2 o'clock, I noticed Brenda standing near the clubhouse entrance with several board members. None of them looked pleased. They weren't watching my yard anymore. They were watching an entire neighborhood that no longer fit neatly inside a binder full of HOA guidelines. Monday night, every chair inside the clubhouse was occupied. People lined the walls. Others stood near the back doors. I recognized faces I'd never seen at a board meeting before. Young families, retirees, veterans, teachers, contractors, gardeners. Brenda adjusted the microphone and cleared her throat. As many of you know, she began, the board has proposed amendments designed to preserve our community's visual standards. She clicked to the first slide. Photographs appeared on the projector. Except this time, they weren't pictures of my yard. There were too many to fit on one screen. House after house displayed cedar planters, native flowers, stone paths, and handmade lanterns. The room grew strangely quiet. Brenda had intended to isolate one homeowner again. Instead, she had accidentally created a slideshow featuring nearly half the neighborhood. For the first time since moving to Brookstone Meadows, I realized she no longer had enough fingers to point at everyone. Brenda clicked to the next slide. This, she said, forcing a confident smile, is precisely why the board believes additional standards are necessary. She pointed toward a photograph of the Petersons' front yard. Cedar planters, native flowers, stone edging, handmade lanterns. Then another slide. Bill's house. Then the Johnsons. Then the Lawsons. Every click brought another yard inspired by the same ideas Brenda had mocked only weeks before. Except something unexpected happened. Nobody laughed. The room remained completely silent. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Brenda glanced around as though waiting for approval that never came. She cleared her throat. Our neighborhood has always maintained a consistent appearance. A hand rose near. The front row. It belonged to Mrs. Lawson. The retired schoolteacher stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from her cardigan before speaking into the microphone. May I ask a question? Brenda nodded. Of course. Mrs. Lawson smiled politely. Which of these yards violates our current rules? The room became even quieter. Brenda looked toward the HOA attorney seated beside her. He opened the governing documents, turned several pages, adjusted his glasses. Finally, he answered, "None of them." Another hand appeared. "Bill, if none of us violated the rules, why are we changing them?" Before Brenda could answer, another resident stood. Then another, the young couple with the stroller. The retired veteran whose butterfly garden now attracted hummingbirds every morning. A nurse who had replaced thirsty shrubs with native plants to conserve water. One by one, people began telling stories. Not arguments. Stories. My granddaughter loves counting butterflies now. My electric bill dropped because the new plants need less watering. We finally know our neighbors because everyone stops to talk outside. I've lived here 12 years, another homeowner said. I've had more conversations this spring than in the previous 5. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse changed. It no longer felt like an HOA meeting. It felt like neighbors speaking honestly for the first time. I remained seated near the middle of the room, listening. Nobody mentioned me directly. They didn't need to. The conversation had grown much larger than one front yard. Brenda attempted to regain control. This isn't about personal preferences. It's about protecting property values. The local realtor sitting near the back quietly stood. Everyone recognized her. She had sold homes inside Brookstone Meadows for nearly 20 years. I'd like to address that. Brenda hesitated before nodding. The realtor smiled. In the past month, I've shown 3 homes here. She paused. Every buyer asked about the gardens. Several homeowners exchanged surprised looks. Not one complained. In fact, she continued, 2 buyers specifically mentioned that the neighborhood finally felt unique instead of looking like every other subdivision. A low murmur spread through the room. Brenda's shoulders stiffened. The argument she had repeated for years suddenly sounded much weaker. The HOA attorney leaned toward her and whispered something too quietly for anyone else to hear. She didn't respond. Instead, she looked down at the stack of amendment papers resting on the podium. The confidence she carried into the meeting had slowly disappeared. Finally, the vice president of the board spoke. I think it's time we vote. Printed ballots were passed from row to row. The only sound inside the clubhouse was the soft scratching of pens across paper. People folded their ballots, placed them into a wooden collection box. Nobody celebrated. Nobody whispered predictions. We simply waited. As the ballots were counted, I noticed Brenda staring at the projector screen behind her. It still displayed photographs of the very gardens she had hoped would become evidence. Instead, they had become proof that an entire neighborhood had already chosen what kind of community it wanted to be. The HOA secretary carried the wooden ballot box to the front of the room and placed it gently on the long folding table. No one spoke. The only sounds were the quiet rustling of paper and the faint hum of the clubhouse air conditioner. Brenda folded her arms. She still wore the same composed expression she had walked in with, but it looked different now. Less confident, more rehearsed. The vice president opened the box and began counting each ballot alongside the HOA attorney. Every vote was read twice. Every tally was checked. No one wanted anyone questioning the result. I glanced around the room. People weren't glaring at Brenda. They weren't whispering about revenge. Most of them simply looked tired. Tired of being told that every home should reflect the same idea of perfection. After several long minutes, the attorney nodded toward the vice president. The count is confirmed. He handed over the final sheet. The vice president adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. The proposed landscape clarification amendment. He paused just long enough for everyone to lean forward. Is rejected. For a heartbeat. The room remained completely still. Then came applause. Not explosive, not theatrical, just honest. The kind of applause people give when a difficult conversation finally ends. Brenda didn't clap. She quietly gathered the papers spread across the podium. Someone near the back stood. It was the young father whose daughter spent every afternoon chasing butterflies through their new flower beds. I'd like to make a motion. The room settled again. I think instead of creating new restrictions, he smiled toward several neighbors. The board should celebrate homeowners who improve the community in different ways. A few people nodded immediately. Mrs. Lawson raised her hand. I'll second that. Laughter rolled gently through the room. Not mocking laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind shared between neighbors who finally felt they were on the same side. One homeowner suggested organizing a neighborhood garden walk every spring. Another proposed planting more native flowers around the entrance sign. Someone volunteered to build birdhouses for the community park. Ideas replaced complaints. Conversations replaced arguments. I realized something as I listened. Nobody was talking about winning. They were talking about building. When the meeting finally adjourned, people lingered instead of rushing toward the parking lot. Clusters of neighbors gathered beneath the soft glow of the clubhouse lights. Phone numbers were exchanged. Gardening tips were shared. Weekend plans were made. Bill walked over and gently bumped my shoulder. You know? He laughed quietly. None of this would have happened if Brenda had simply ignored your garden. I've been thinking the same thing. Across the room, Brenda slipped her folders into a leather bag. For the first time since we'd met, she avoided looking toward me. There was no dramatic confrontation, no angry speech, no public apology. She simply walked out through the clubhouse doors and disappeared into the cool evening air. I waited a few minutes before leaving. Outside, the neighborhood looked different beneath the streetlights. Warm porch lights glowed across houses that no longer looked identical. Some displayed cedar planters. Others featured winding stone paths. Native flowers moved gently in the night breeze. Every yard carried its own personality. Every family had added something unique. As I walked home beneath the quiet spring sky, I realized the greatest irony of all. Brenda had spent years trying to protect the neighborhood's identity. Instead, by trying to shame one homeowner, she had accidentally inspired the entire community to discover one. The silence that settled over Brookstone Meadows that night felt completely different from the silence I noticed on my first morning there. Back then, everything had looked the same. Now every yard told a different story. And somehow, that made the whole neighborhood finally feel like home. 6 months later, I stood in my front yard just before sunrise with a watering can in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The neighborhood was quiet again, but it was no longer the same silence I had found when I first moved into Brookstone Meadows. Now it was filled with life. Songbirds hopped between native grasses. Bees drifted lazily across purple coneflowers. Butterflies floated through flower beds that hadn't existed half a year earlier. The air smelled of cedar warmed by the first rays of morning sun, mixed with damp soil from an overnight rain. I slowly walked along the stone path I had built from reclaimed river rock, running my hand across the weathered cedar planter that had somehow changed far more than my own yard. Across the street, the Peterson children were already outside searching for caterpillars before breakfast. Bill waved from his porch while trimming lavender beside his mailbox. Mrs. Lawson carefully filled a small bird bath she had installed after our neighborhood garden walk became an annual tradition. Nobody had planned any of it. It simply happened. One good idea encouraged another. The HOA eventually replaced the old landscaping committee with a volunteer neighborhood beautification group. Instead of approving identical designs, they organized seasonal garden tours, native planting workshops, and community cleanup weekends. Participation was completely voluntary. Ironically, more people became involved than ever before. One Saturday afternoon, while repairing a loose lantern beside my porch, I heard familiar footsteps approaching along the sidewalk. Not sharp designer heels this time, just slow, measured footsteps. I looked up. Brenda Holloway stood at the edge of my driveway. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. No folders. No violation notices. Only a small paper bag from the local garden center. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked toward one of the cedar planters. It weathered nicely. It did. She nodded almost to herself. I planted coneflowers. I smiled. How are they doing? They're attracting butterflies. The corner of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. My granddaughter likes watching them. There was another brief silence. I suppose, she said carefully, people enjoy having something that feels like their own. I think they do. She glanced down the street where every yard looked different, yet somehow belonged together more than ever before. I misjudged that. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Sometimes honesty is enough. She handed me the paper bag. I bought too many wildflower seeds. I accepted it with a smile. Thank you. Then she walked home beneath the shade of the maple trees without another word. I never saw another newsletter using someone's home as an example of what not to do. I never received another warning for my garden. And every spring after that, new homeowners usually stopped by my front yard within their first week. Not because someone told them they had to, because neighbors pointed them here. They wanted ideas, not copies. Ideas. As the sun climbed higher, children laughed somewhere farther down the street while wind gently moved through the native grasses lining the sidewalks. I looked across Brookstone Meadows and realized the neighborhood had become exactly what every community hopes to be. Not perfect. Personal. Not controlled. Connected. People often ask whether my garden won the fight against the HOA. I always tell them they're asking the wrong question. The garden didn't win. The neighborhood did. Because the moment people stopped trying to make every house look the same, they finally started seeing the people who lived inside them. And that, more than any flower or cedar planter, was the most beautiful thing that ever grew on our street.